Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Holler. I'm the president and CEO of the museum, and on behalf of our trustees and our members and our staff and everyone involved in the museum, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Tonight, we examine the future of what we're only half-jokingly calling not your father's internet, and I suppose I should quickly add, not your mother's internet either. The ultimate openness of the internet has unleashed all that is good and free and entrepreneurial in hundreds of millions of people around the world. It has also liberated, as so often happens, much that is dark and coarse and greedy. Like so many great media of the last century, the net has become a proving ground in the struggle between freedom and control, between invention and suppression, between commerce and the public interest, and between content that uplifts and inspires and content that does not. In short, the internet now reflects all of the drive, desire, quirks, and foibles of humankind. Which set of forces are going to gain the upper hand in the future? What tools will we choose to settle issues around privacy, identity, democracy, and commercial gain? Can public and private interests be reconciled within this, perhaps the most powerful means of global interconnection we've ever seen? Is that cosmic enough for you as a series of questions? Well, tonight we have just the women who spend much of their time helping to sort out both the social and technical issues bound up in these questions about the future. Dr. Genevieve Bell is an Intel Fellow and the Director of Intel's Interactions and Experience Research Lab. Dr. Bell joined Intel in 1998 as one of its first anthropologists. It may seem amazing and unusual to you that Intel has anthropologists not only working at Intel, but thinks enough of the endeavor to make Dr. Bell an Intel Fellow. But she's doing extremely important work there, helping to drive the company's first overseas field studies, conducting groundbreaking research on the interaction between humans and technology, and in particular, working to create within Intel a visionary plan for the future of all kinds of electronic media, and especially television. She currently leads a research and development lab that is expanding her rather revolutionary insights to the rest of the company, and she leads a team of social scientists, interaction designers, human factor engineers, and a wide range of talented technologists, and they're working on how a user-centered experience and design can continue to transform technology in human hands. She received her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Bryn Mawr. She received her advanced degrees, including her doctorate, from Stanford. She was South Australia's 15th Thinker in Residence, and she is about to publish a new book called Divining the Digital Future, co-authored with Professor Paul Durish. It will be published by the MIT Press in the spring of next year. Dr. Abigail De Kosnik is an assistant professor at the University of California at Berkeley, in the Berkeley Center for New Media, and in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. She has two books forthcoming: The Survival of Soap Opera, Strategies for a New Media Era. It's a very provocative title. And Illegitimate Media, Minority Discourse and the Censorship of Digital Remix Culture. We had Larry Lessig here not very long ago talking about remix. I hope you were here for that. Last December, she organized a major conference on the future of the internet, communities, and the public interest on the Berkeley campus. She is a leading thinker and scholar in this area. And to conduct the conversation, not just between the two of them, but really among all three of them, is Laura Sydell, who reports for NPR from her base in San Francisco as the digital culture correspondent, reporting on the arts and technology. You hear Laura regularly on All Things Considered, on Morning Edition and Weekend Edition. NPR has been a very important partner to us in this Net at 40 series, and we hope to expand our partnership with NPR in the future. Laura combines the research and legwork of good old-fashioned beat reporting with a contemporary view of how technology is changing the way that we work and live. She undertakes to explain those somewhat complicated changes in ways that we can all understand, listening to public radio. She's received a host of awards for her reporting. One of our favorite pieces that Laura has ever done was on the Babbage engine. back in January, and our own Tim Robinson this year, and it had the effect of nearly doubling attendance at our Babbage demonstrations almost overnight. So Laura's a good friend of the museum, as are Dr. Bell and Dr. De Kosnik. They're all coming up now. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage, and we'll get underway.
So, I wanted to just say a few things before we started. I want to go back actually further than 40 years ago. Well, they were talking about 2,000 years ago, and in fact, I wanted to go back to a story that would have happened when a very early technology known as writing came along. There's a section in Plato's Phaedrus. It's a story that's told by Socrates, and I'm going to sum it up a bit, but there was a famous god by the name of Thuth, and Thuth was an inventor. And he went to show many of his inventions to the king of Egypt, Thamus. And Thamus liked some of his inventions, which included arithmetic and geometry. And then he came to letters and written language. And Thuth looked at it, and he showed it to the king, and the king said, wait a minute, but what's going to happen to people's memories? And I confess to sort of taking that little parable from the late media scholar Neil Postman's book, because he begins it as a great way to talk about technology, how here you have the inventor who sees all the wonderful things that writing is going to do. And then you have the king who sits back and says, but wait a minute, and I think with every technology that we invent, and this, in fact, when I'm reporting, I always try to think about it this way. It's going to do something wonderful, but it may have some side effects that we're not so happy about. And so I feel like as we're looking back at the net 40 years, we can see some incredibly wonderful things that have happened. The people who first created the internet, many of them were idealists, or they were trying to solve a very practical problem. They had some computers at major universities, and they couldn't share information easily, and they wanted to share information. And information is good, right? Information wants to be free, but it's great if the information is accurate. As we've certainly seen over time, a lot of the information on the internet is not. So this evening, I want to talk about where we are a bit with the net. I imagine those people who founded it probably didn't imagine that people would use it to order pizza, but here we are. People can order pizza over the internet. One of the things I think that's happened is there was an idea that in some ways, if the world could share information, we would all come together. We would all start to talk the same language. We would all start to be one planet, this sort of vision of Star Trek, right? But I wonder if that's what's really happening. I think there's a lot of questions about that. And Abigail, you've done some work on, I think, various groups and the way the internet has broken out from fandom to gender and race. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about the ways in which maybe the internet is not necessarily something that's ended up uniting us.
Yeah, well, Laura is also referring to a piece that she did, which I was one of the, I was one of her interviewees last December, for a piece that was asking a question about community, about whether the internet has become too fractured, too compartmentalized, almost suburbanized, where people just hang out in these silos with other people who agree with them on any number of cultural or social issues or political issues. In other words, that there isn't real debate happening online. We all just stick to whatever community agrees with our views, and that becomes an echo chamber that gets reinforced. And that's certainly one view of the way that the net has facilitated everyone getting to have what they want, finally to have the content, the discussions that they always wanted to have. And we used to have to maybe temper things that we said. We used to maybe have to consider that a large number of people we were speaking to did not share our beliefs. And so the internet has fostered a lot of diversity, but also maybe some distancing between communities. The thing that I appreciate about the internet's diversity and allowing for communities and fandoms to grow up that are very specific to people's taste cultures and people's interests, people's political views, is that I think that those views have been enriched by that there is a greater depth of discussion in any one taste, culture, or political community, that there is a lot of reinforcement that is positive because the depth of discussion gets to be so much, it is deeper. But I'd see the other view too.
Well, you actually looked at sort of what you call political fandom around Hillary Clinton, for example, and a kind of reinforcing that took place in those communities. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that.
Well, there do come these moments when fandom matters, and what community you're in all of a sudden has to join with the community you were against just the day before. So the day that Hillary Clinton conceded the Democratic nomination, all of the Hillary fans sort of had to become Obama fans. The fandoms had to merge. And that's a very strange point for online culture, when for months and months, maybe longer than a year, all you've been doing is campaigning for one person online. All of a sudden you have to find a way to make peace with your enemies and to all campaign together for the candidate who won. And that is,
Did it happen?
And it didn't really happen that well. And a lot of Hillary fans did not join the Obama bandwagon. And I think that was a telling moment in terms of how can we allow for diversity of expression online, but then also say this is a common cause, as many differences as we had on this issue before, now these groups have to come together, and how can we respect that difference? I think that there is a way that the Obama campaign online could have sort of acknowledged the fact that they were asking the Hillary fans to join. It could have done a little more soliciting of the minority viewpoint, basically the viewpoint that lost. And instead, there was a lot of braggadocio, a lot of "we told you so," because it had won. I mean, the Hillary fandom had been their enemy. So it treated the people that should have been their friends as their enemies still. And I think that peace was really only made between the camps with Hillary's appointment to Secretary of State. Even that, I'm not sure that the Hillary fans are so on board.
Yeah, I'm not either. I've talked to people who aren't. Now, you have done a lot of research in Australia, and you've looked at different communities and actually found that not only are they perhaps breaking down, but they're using it in different ways.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, I come at it in such a different kind of way, right? I'm always really struck as an anthropologist who spends a lot of my time outside of the US about the ways in which the conversation about the internet gets very rooted in the American experience rather than kind of taking a kind of a broader sort of whack at it, right? And I'm really struck in thinking about the time I've worked in the technology industry starting in 1998. If you look at the statistics on internet use then, right, 70% of internet users were in the United States. Flash forward to now and we're talking about less than 20%. So in that kind of period of time, there's a whole series of new communities of users and of practice and of all the kind of practicalities of that have come online and brought with them really different expectations. I mean, whether it's just the fact that the fastest growing languages of online users are Mandarin, so Chinese, Hindi, Bengali, and Arabic, and Spanish, in fact. And all of those bring with them not just different kind of practicalities about input, about where your eyes track on the screen. So the notion that the most important information should be in the top right-hand corner doesn't track across all of those language groups because of the ways information is organized. Completely different ideas about knowledge. So we still think of sort of information on the internet, and you look at things like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is built on an encyclopedia project that's rooted in 1,600 years of Western philosophical thought, where things are organized by topic in particular kind of categories, right? I mean, the patron saint of the internet is actually the patron saint of encyclopedias. Same guy, Isidore of Sevilla, invented the encyclopedia, became the patron saint of the internet. That the internet has a patron saint is a really interesting thing. And there was in fact a competition that the Vatican organized to get a patron saint of the internet, which is even more astonishing, and the kind of write-in possible candidates were interesting, and there is in fact a prayer that you can say to Isadora to protect the internet.
I'm setting up a little prayer spot at my home.
Oh no, no, he is in fact sold with candles for the internet. I mean, it's an astonishing kind of thing. But the notion that there will be different sort of knowledge practices that come online. I mean, the kind of the example I'm always struck by, right, is The most prolific search engine in China has always been Baidu, which was a local Chinese enterprise. When you actually go to the Baidu's website and you start to look at how the company came into formation, even the name of the company signals something different. So the word Baidu is actually a phrase out of classic song poetry, so classic Chinese, a particular period in Chinese history. It's a very particular poem. If you were raised in China, you would recognize this snippet immediately. And it's about searching for a woman, this beautiful woman in the mist, and never finding her.
So you thought you could find everything on the internet? No. Well, in China...
No, but in fact, the notion that you would name a search engine after the impossibility of the search itself sort of signals something about the complications of searching Mandarin, right? I mean, Mandarin as a language is often about, can you get the tonality right? Does the word in pinyin, i.e. the Romanized version, get you to all the possible derivatives? People will always say, as they would also say of Sanskrit-based languages, so Hindi in particular, it's often about what isn't there, not what is. So you need to know what was the word next to, and what is the word that it's always said with. And the thing about search engines, we know, and you would know this too, right, is they're really good at searching text. They're not very good at searching subtext. Turns out they're terrible for searching kind of missing text. And the notion of what it would mean to search sort of metaphor and allegory is so beyond the way we currently think about kind of knowledge that for me, the next kind of decade of thinking what it means to bring all those other kind of ways of thinking about the world online just becomes radically different.
Right, and we're very far, I think, from that, although maybe closer than we think. In looking at the kinds of cultural things, though, that you've seen, you mentioned that there are ways, at least in this country, that people do come together and meet each other across boundaries.
Sure. I think there are ways that minority groups, that communities that have been marginalized by mainstream culture for many, many decades, centuries, have been able to coalesce at a distance online. If you're a gay teenager and you need some advice on how to come out to your parents, or even whether that's a good time when you're a teenager to come out to your parents, I think that although, of course, there were informal networks of mentoring always for that community, I think it is easier to find. It is easier to get knowledge, to have communication, and I think that it's easier for the parent of a gay teenager to also enter into that discussion, to also sort of wonder, what is my child going through and how can I approach that? And there are communities for that person too. And I think there's a lot of display of one would call really liminal activity, like young girls curious about sex, about whether they want to be their parents' religion, or there are many ways that young people play with identity online that are coded in face-to-face life as quite dangerous. I mean, girls wearing high cutoff shorts and shirts that expose their midriffs and experimenting with radical hairstyles is really coded as quite dangerous, maybe even pathological in some way. I mean, if you saw a girl walking down the street like that, you'd maybe think to yourself, should I mention that to her parents, or are they doing anything about her? But that kind of play and fantasy is important to a young identity forming, and the online space does allow people to do more of that and to get in touch with other people at the same stage of life that are doing some of that play and fantasy. So I think that it has made a lot of things easier that before were very liminal, very marginal, and dangerous to play with in face-to-face life.
And maybe some people probably think they should continue to be. I mean, we have things like, sexting, the term that sort of came up where, teens have been sharing naked pictures of themselves via text message and things like that. And so this is definitely a bit of a side effect of some of this communication, is indeed this ability to meet up whoever shares your very particular interest. I'm wondering, since you've done a lot more international look at the internet, whether or not your sense is that people from very different places using the internet in very different ways are finding any place to meet.
I mean, I think both of those things happen simultaneously. I mean, one of the things that I think is most interesting about the internet is that you can both be in your local community with a series of mirrors that get held up to you that make you feel comfortable and safe about who you are, because it's people who are like you. And then there are other places you can go where it's all about radical difference. And I think in many places people inhabit both of those spaces, and I'm struck by some of the strategies communities then use to manage that. So I grew up in Aboriginal communities in Australia. My mother's also an anthropologist, so I grew up living on Aboriginal reservations basically in Australia, and there's a lot of sensitivity in those communities to photographs, and particularly photographs that contain images of people who are dead. And so there's a series of websites in Australia now that have this really interesting notion of information not being free and not being available. And in fact, as you hit those websites, there's a series of splash screens that actually say to you, if you are a person from these nations, there is content here that might upset you. Are you okay with proceeding? Next screen, are you sure you're okay with proceeding? This is the kind of information you want. Next screen, actually some of this information isn't available online anyway. You need to go to a library where someone can verify that you're the right person to even see this. And this notion of kind of gating the internet in order to protect cultural sensibility is fascinating. By the same token, there's lots of other places that are doing things that are again about that kind of creating safe community practice. So the Shanghai city government for the last 5 years has been promoting online burials. There's absence of space in Shanghai, so now you cremate, and you have an entire government-built website dedicated to building online shrines. And the entire thing is done in the vernacular of what would have been an ancestral lineage hall from pre-revolutionary days. But it's seen as being a place you go. It's in fact ironically let people kind of rebuild these lineage halls that have become very difficult after the Cultural Revolution. But it's definitely a space that if you hit it as someone who wasn't raised in that tradition, you would have no idea what you were looking at. And it would be very bewildering. And I think for me, there's that, there is that sense still, because you've got this incredible diversity, that you can go to places online and encounter extraordinary cultural difference that is almost unintelligible, but fascinating as a result of that. And then places you can go where it is the conversations that are necessary and familiar.
It seems to me, though, you have to look for it if you're going to find it. And I guess there's a question of whether or not most people are really going to go and look.
No, absolutely. And I think that was always one of the challenges about everything else, right? I mean, you could have lots of books in a library, but unless you were willing to go to the back stack, it wasn't going to come to you. So I think, that notion of what people found and what people didn't is not necessarily kind of as radical as it sounds, but it's also gated in different ways, right? I mean, we talk about the internet as though it were a seamless whole. And I've just been back home in Australia, and we're having a conversation about having a national broadband system. And a conversation about how fast can we make the pipes. We're very excited about this. And we can get them really fast inside the country. But if you think of a map of the world, Australia is a long way away from everything else. So we can go really fast inside the country, and we still get really slow going everywhere else. So the Australian experience of the internet is great if you want stuff that's local. If you want things that are cached on a server in America or in Britain, there's still actually a perceivable difference where you're left going, oh yeah, that's right, this is coming from somewhere far away. So even the speed of the internet has this kind of sense of geography to it, which I think is really interesting.
Well, I think that's true, and we have been talking about prior to this evening the sort of different regulations that you're starting to see develop, both in this country and around the world, and a sense of, I think, because of some of what's going on in the internet being actually a little frightening to people. I recently did some reporting on the iPad and how, in many ways, the iPad and its applications are kind of a walled garden or a gated community, and that many people might prefer, in fact, to have their access to certain things censored by Apple or Steve Jobs, whatever Steve's taste happens to be today. There was recently, the high-profile story about Mark Fiore, the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist whose app was censored, and then he won the Pulitzer Prize, and Steve Jobs went, "Oh, really sorry, we didn't mean to do that." But clearly they didn't like the political nature of these cartoons because he's a very political cartoonist, and so it makes me think that as we move forward and there is all this openness in these little communities and people who can find each other, that maybe that isn't necessarily what people want. What you're telling me about this community, they don't want to see these pictures.
Yeah. And in fact, I think, what's most interesting about the debates we then have about how content is regulated online often start in a very particular kind of place, right? But I'm really struck when I look globally about who it is that thinks they have a stake in the conversation about technology and who fronts up to those conversations, right? I mean, I think, historically we have notions of governmental agencies. We sometimes think there are people who are engaged in censoring content, in regulating the infrastructure. And then I think increasingly are a whole group of other people we haven't thought of as being in the conversation but clearly want to have a voice. Whether it was when Cairo, the city of Cairo, got its first wireless cloud. So they actually built out a wireless cloud for Cairo. And Cairo, if you've never been, is a city with an extraordinary landscape of mosques and a lot of minaret towers that go with those mosques. And it's an extraordinary soundscape. Cairo is a very noisy city because 5 times a day at Salah, there was a call to prayer from every single one of those mosques. Obviously one of those mosques. And
in fact, they're just standardizing that now.
Well, and in fact, what the wireless cloud conversation was one where there was this debate in Egyptian parliament between the Minister of IT and the Minister of Religion and Culture, with the Minister of IT putting the Quran on the table and saying, the Prophet says we should find the most beautiful voice, so I reckon we should record it, have a competition, put it on this cloud, and we can just standardize every mosque in town. One voice, we're good to go. And the Minister of Religion's going, that's not what the Prophet meant at all. And this extraordinary debate ensued about a document that's 1,600 years old, about, what the right interpretation was and what it was that might have been wanted. And it left you realizing that debates about technology don't always just include technologists. There are other people who think they're going to have a seat at the table and who will bring really interesting rationales for doing that.
And that's the very danger, I think, of having, I like to think of the internet as fostering what I would call a curatorial sensibility. In other words, there is so much that it is like wandering through a library, a huge archive, and not really knowing, there's not a clear path about which direction you should take, which aisles will have the right books for you or the right videos. You have to curate the internet for yourself. And I'm very suspicious of the curators being centralized and only technologists, for instance, or only corporations. It would be just as bad if only the government were to be the sole curator of the internet. In other words, what a distributed network permits, a culture distributed over a network, is it permits every user to be their own curator. Now, being your own curator, it gives you a lot of responsibility. You have to be responsible for knowing what you want from this network, knowing what you want to pull and what you do not want to pull. And that means setting up gates in your mind, sort of, and in your usage habits. You have to decide, I'm not going to be online 20 hours out of 24 every day. You have to decide that. Because television used to turn off, for you. Do you remember that? It used to end.
I think some of you do remember that, I guess, in this audience.
You would sort of wake up to the sound of the national anthem, and I don't even remember what time it was, and the television would have been color bars, and you would say, oh, I fell asleep in front of the television again. Well, the internet doesn't end. It doesn't end in time, and it doesn't end in content yet. And so we each have to decide for ourselves, I'm in a flame war on the Huffington Post. How long am I going to be in this flame war? How far am I going to push my point online before I just say, I don't want to participate like this anymore? And how do we participate, and when do we stand up to what we perceive as racism or gender bias online? And when do we just say, that person's crazy, I'm just not talking to them anymore? And there is this fluidity of being able to go everywhere and just knowing in yourself what you will and won't do. And I think that there is a curatorial sensibility that we are just now in the early stages of formulating. How do we use the internet? How are we supposed to approach it? What is the etiquette? How should we speak to one another online? What is permissible as public discourse, as the public sphere? And what kind of user are you? We don't even have terms for those demographics yet. I could call myself, I am a culturally curious internet user. I am a culinary and fashion-based user. Of course, all those things could also interconnect. It's like we don't even have correct names for those categories yet, but I would rather that we define them, the users of the internet, rather than any one company or any one provider of content determine that.
Well, I think one question is whether or not we will get to that place. I think, in fact, the people who initially developed the internet did want to have a very free and open dialogue. But I think at the same time right now, I mentioned sort of the world of the app and the device. You know, your phones, mobile devices, are increasingly important ways that we connect to the internet. And mobile devices in the United States are very closed in many ways. You have to buy a phone that's connected to a particular provider. That provider tells you what apps you can put on your phone. So in that way, there's a sort of technological closing out that may be happening with some mobile devices. Outside of this country, in China, for example, you have a regulatory structure that, having been in China and experimented with the internet there, you know, the government definitely does have a real hold on what you can do. And what's interesting, or what I found personally interesting in China, was the degree to which the people who lived there were actually pretty content with it. And that because they live in a country where they expect their government to do quite a lot for them, and that is how they are raised, they expect that the government will protect them from the bad things on the internet. And I guess I know you have traveled widely as well, what your take on that is, you know.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I know it's sometimes a hard thing to say, but I think we have to look back at those early conversations, aspirations, and hopes for the internet and recognize them for what they were, which was that they were also cultural statements themselves, right? I mean, there were statements about what was valuable in America at a very particular point in time, and for some other kind of, you know, parts of the world too, but they were really conversations that were already in dialogue with things that had been in the recent past then, and they were in some ways ideological statements. When we talk about freedom, we talk about democracy, we talk about information, those are all incredibly loaded terms. I mean, you know, I come from a democracy, but my democracy looks very different than yours. I mean, you know, I come from Australia. Voting is compulsory in Australia. We have a federal election on Saturday. I was home last week. I cast a vote because if I didn't, they would fine me, then they would smack me on my wrist, and eventually they would take away my right to vote. And for Australians, it's a shameful thing not to vote. But the notion of legislating voting as a requirement, I know I say that in this country, voting is compulsory where I'm from, is a very different thing than what it is here, right? So even the notion of democracy is profoundly kind of culturally located. So it doesn't surprise me that as people think about what it means to have an internet that has a democratic impulse, what that democratic impulse is looks slightly different. And so people's kind of ideas about what's then the role of government. And, you know, again, I also come from a place where, you know, we imagine that the government has a role in creating civic discourse and civic society and of setting some of the terms of the debate. And I think, you know, it's no great surprise that there are lots of places in the world where the internet looks very different because it is being driven by different regulators. It's sometimes in a different set of contexts. I mean, whether it's Britain thinking about what it means to have the internet against the backdrop of the BBC, where the BBC's always had a kind of agenda of educating the entire of the country to a shared kind of cultural repertoire, which is a very different agenda than we've had in the United States. So I mean, it's not a surprise to me that as the internet has grown up in other places, it's grown up with different kinds of ideologies, right? And I think one of the hard things that Abigail is pointing to here is what happens when those different imaginings of what appear to be the same thing start to have to butt up against each other. What does it mean to have British democracy and Australian democracy and American democracy and what democracy might look like in India and Indonesia, all banging up against one another with different ideas about who gets a say, who regulates things, whether there are things that are unsayable on the internet, and what does it mean when the internet turns up on mobile phones or television? And, you know, who's going to regulate the content in those places? I think all of those conversations are going to look slightly and sometimes radically different from one another.
I mean, I think, you know, really technologies in the way that they are built do have ideologies behind them.
Absolutely.
And the internet did. There definitely was. And I think actually initially when the internet was commercialized, there were, you know, a lot of students on these campuses because it was initially on all these campuses and they saw it as this educational thing. They were actually not happy that it was being commercialized because they had a very particular idea about what this thing should represent, and it was very different when you commercialized it.
And it looks like flying toasters.
Yeah, it looks like flying toasters, exactly. And I think in this country we do have this idea. But I also think that as it is getting commercialized, we started to talk a little bit about the whole net neutrality debate. So maybe in China, you see a way in which the government is stepping in to sort of curate it, decide what's on it. And here, I do wonder if, and I think many people are fearful, in fact, that large corporations will, in fact, begin to curate the internet for us. And again, many people may prefer it. I'm not saying, you know, but I know you had you definitely had strong feelings about this. If people have been following, recently Google made a proposal with Verizon that they called was sort of a mix between, they actually said it was saving the openness of the internet or net neutrality, but they did propose a very specific separate channel on the internet that would allow, say, companies to have a defined channel for medical use or for entertainment use, and that it would be different from the regular internet. And a lot of people were very upset about this proposal.
Well, the difference is between what the proposal called wireline internet, which is the hard, you know, the internet that you would get from plugging a cable, DSL cable into your machine, or you know, using Comcast cable, something like that, and wireless internet. And the idea that wireline internet would be protected, that net neutrality would be enforced for wireline internet and not enforced for wireless internet, is basically a clear aim at the future. Because what is the future of building out the internet? It's wireless. To say, as you know, I think it was Yobi Benjamin on the SF Gate blog yesterday, to say that we want to protect the neutrality of the wireline internet is like saying we want to regulate the horse and buggy. That's great, you know, and maybe there still are horses and buggies around today, but nobody cares about them. The future is wireless, and so this becomes an issue for the developed nations that already have a lot of broadband access, that are now becoming more mobile, that are now carrying around portable computers. It becomes an issue for these nations because right now you can use Hulu and you can use Netflix. You can use YouTube to stream video. You have this choice. But as you said, Laura, apps are connected to your phone and to a specific carrier. If carriers like Verizon are allowed to replicate a Hulu and then ban Hulu from their mobile service, that means that if you have a phone that, you know, only works on Verizon, you'll only ever use Verizon Hulu. You know, you'll never have the option of using the other web application, because the actual device and the way that the internet works for that device will not allow you to do that. So if we allow applications to be owned and replicated that way, then that's a very different internet all of a sudden that we're talking about. Now internationally, in a place like the Philippines where I was born, the future is absolutely wireless. They're not going to spend a whole lot of money laying down cable. So that means they're going to build wireless towers, which are easy to do, and send signal that way. And then as that country becomes more digitized, everybody will be working on a mobile machine. Primarily. I mean, then it will be a very mobile internet culture. Now, in that culture, who will get to determine what flows through what is basically the predominant internet of that culture? If it is just one or two companies, then that's what I foresee as a problem. Although maybe nobody will miss it. I mean, there is that possibility too. That
I said,
acculturation and custom means something too.
I'm curious whether or not you feel like this is a debate that's an international debate.
I mean, it gets played out in different ways in different places. I mean, I think, you know, Abigail's entirely right. I mean, the Philippines is a fascinating one for thinking about what's already happened in the mobile space and who's felt the need to regulate things there. I mean, my favorite example of Philippine activity is actually when the Philippine bishops got together 6 years ago and made it illegal to confess one's sins via SMS, fax, and email. And those of you who were raised Catholic know the point at which the Catholics decide they need to ban something means it must have been a lot of it happening. And it turned out the concern was less about practitioners than it was about where the priests were, because if you were faxing them, they could be, or texting them, they could be anywhere too. So there's all the notions about contrition, right? But it meant that there were a whole, again, it's this whole kind of different set of people who feel like they have and I always thought it was a great shame. I mean, 2HF, 3OM was all good. Hail Marys, our fathers was all good text message, but no. So I mean, I think, part of it is it's going to be different stakeholders in the conversation. Part of it is, I think, we need to distinguish between the internet and the web here, and thinking about, what it means to have the internet also starting to arrive in China, for instance, as a backhaul for smart, true two-way electrical meters. So what does it mean when the internet now becomes a mechanism by which your power company can scrutinize your electricity use and determine what it means for you to be a heavy user or a light user and decide that you just may be using too much electricity right now, is again a different set of people in the conversation. Think about what it means to go to a digital switchover when television is now delivered by an internet backbone too, means that we now have another set of people in the conversation about what does it mean to have a watershed hour on television. I mean, what used to be after 8 o'clock at night, you knew you'd see something very different until the flag happened in Australia, till we got God Save the Queen. Until television went off, we knew different kinds of experiences would happen. But what it becomes the point when the internet is delivering that experience to television, does that mean you impose a watershed hour on the internet? So there's a whole series of kind of questions where, in fact, when I listen to what's going on in places that have had the digital switchover, where people are starting to think about an IP backbone for other things, it's a very different set of anxieties. I mean, some of it comes down to the same things. Who's going to control information? Who's going to make decisions about what I should be doing and what I shouldn't? I think underwriting a lot of it is, what will people think about me? I mean, I'm really struck in a lot of the work we've done recently that the kind of conversations that I think we were all having over the last 10 years about privacy have really shifted to conversations about reputation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have a lot of people say to me, well, if my television knows what I'm viewing and it tells the internet, that's bad. And you're like, wait, you just said it was too much work to tell the internet. They're like, no, but the television would tell the truth. And you suddenly realize, of course, that we are busily, talking about what we're watching and being much more careful to report that we watch it ironically or only once or only because we're
Somebody
folding.
was over that night.
Exactly, and they had the remote control and I had no control in it, right? And when I look at the kind of ways that people now start to reflect back what their anxieties are about this proliferation of connectivity, it's much more in places like, what will other people think about me? I secretly think we're all convinced that the world will work out just how dorky we all really are if our devices could tell those stories. So I think there's a sort of a series of places where that conversation is going that isn't just about net neutrality elsewhere, but is about who's going to regulate it. It becomes conversations about price as much as it does about, who's going to control things. I think it's very much a conversation about what kind of devices are we talking about. I mean, in places where there's been a mobile infrastructure long before there was a fixed Y1, or better yet, in places where there are many users but only one machine. So think of the kind of the entire internet cafe culture of most of the African subcontinent, right? You're not likely to have a PC at home. You'll go to a cyber cafe to use it. And thinking about what it means to have one machine and many users, and where those many users may have very different intentionalities, how the machine gets regulated, whether you regulate at an internet address, whether you regulate at an IP address, whether you regulate at your mailbox, all become these kind of much more complicated questions.
I mean, I think here, arguably, I realize I should say that the companies say that they need to have these separate channels and have some opportunity to monetize what they're doing because it's very expensive to build it out. In many other countries, the government has been much more involved in building it out. I think that may be the case in Australia.
Absolutely.
And it's certainly been the case in South Korea, where the government was extremely involved in building it out, and to my knowledge is actually pretty hands-off still in this particular way.
Yeah, though fascinatingly, Korea is one of the places where, while the government did in fact, basically what's called the broadband miracle of, high-speed internet connections to about 80% of all households, one of the things they did do, which completely changed the dynamics of the Korean internet, was that they actually charged ISPs for every virus that got out on their networks. So if you as an ISP, it's very sneaky, if you as an ISP could be traced back as the origin point to a virus attack, you were fined for every machine that virus infected. Viruses in South Korea? But it was a very different way of thinking about how you regulated behavior, right?
That's a really good idea. I think they should consider that here. That's a regulation I could really live with, One thing we actually just started to touch on, though, was, in fact, the issue of privacy. I was here last time they had a 40 net speaker. It was Mr. Zuckerberg from Facebook, and of course the issue of privacy has come up generally around Facebook and social media and all of this, and I wonder to what degree people who are in fan clubs, who are doing all of these kinds of things, who are on the internet playing and showing off, are thinking, like, what if somebody sees this?
There have been issues in online communities about outing, about being outed as kind of an aggressive, oppositional, an attack on your person. That if a person is a member of a certain online community and it's a fan community around, well, Star Trek seems pretty safe these days, but you know, I mean, there are plenty of texts, media texts around which fandoms form that aren't regarded as very legitimate or respectable or something like that. And people who are very active members of these communities who write stories and post videos and post art and, you know, are very active online under a pseudonym can get outed, for example, to their workplace. That's happened, you know, several times in the last couple years, and that idea of outing is a very strange and interesting phenomenon. I mean, it's a part of what we all as an internet culture have to come to terms with, that we have several identities operating at the same time, perhaps. Perhaps many of us have many identities that are operational, and what happens when they start to meet each other, or when people start to assign your name in the workforce with your name online, and the work that you do there in as your online identity. I personally, and I think I'm not in the majority with this view, I personally believe in a kind of internet culture, I mean a kind of real life culture, that would allow for the weirdness of people's multiple identities. In other words, I think that once we all accept that what the internet has done is simply make visible that we're really weird, that there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on in our heads that, you know, I mean, we all have records that we want to listen to 1,000,000 times for no reason, and we all have a really strange collection of magazines or books or things that we just like in culture, and the internet makes that huge conglomeration of stuff that we like visible to everybody. If we all just accept that we each of us are multiple, that we each of us have split ways of operating and identifying, and some of those are very playful and others are very serious, then I think outing would not be so much of a concern. I think then we could allow for that split identity to just be a fact of an internet life.
I guess the question is whether or not we can, because a lot of times I still feel what happens is there's the got you factor. People get caught doing a lot of things these days on the internet. You know, the YouTube and various places, you know, there you are. There's Cliff Nass, who is a professor at Stanford in the communications department, who does a lot of research on internet behavior, was talking about Facebook. And he said, well, you know, the thing about Facebook is that most of the time you're out there, you're living your life, and you move from one place to another, and you have a relationship with this person, and you show them this face, and you show somebody else that face. But on Facebook, you're everybody you ever were, all at once. And in some ways, this is very new to our society, I think, just as people, in terms of how it affects us to suddenly be out there in this kind of way.
Though I have to say, I remember being the first time I did fieldwork in Korea, so quite some time ago now, and I know things have changed, but in that first period I was in Korea was when Second Life was really big here. Remember the Pleistocene of that. And I remember Koreans saying to me, so let me see if I understand this. Americans go to Second Life and they pretend to be other people. I was like, well, certainly some of them do, yes. I mean, they're kind of playing with their identities. They're like, why are they doing that? I'm like, well, you know, it's this opportunity, and it's this kind of, you know, Abigail's story. It's this opportunity to kind of, you know, think about who you are and kind of play with your identity. And these 20-something Koreans looked at me and said, what a wasted opportunity to network. And I went, what? And then they proceeded to explain to me about SciWorld, which is at that point was the biggest, you know, social networking site on the web. It is now, you know, still a very dominant one, but dominant in Korea. And these young women said to me, well, we get up in the morning, we get up our avatars, we dress our avatars to match us. So the avatar and they were in the same clothing, same hair, same outfits, and we send them off into SciWorld and we go off to work. And I said, why would you do that? They're like, well, every opportunity is an opportunity to expand your social network. And why would you want to expand your social network if it wasn't you? And as far as they were concerned, this notion of playing online as anyone else was an extraordinarily wasted opportunity to grow your network of contacts who knew who you, quote unquote, really were. And there was this completely different notion of what the internet did, was that it expanded something that was incredibly important in Korean culture, which is your network and your name and your lineage. And you are the number of people your family knows and your name is known by. And the notion that you would waste that was something that people just thought was extraordinarily reckless. And they had a very hard time understanding why it is that you would play online with identity when it could be an extension of what your family was already up to.
There was no sense that you might want to play, or indeed play or show different sides of yourself, or at all?
No. That would be a waste of time. Now, it's changed now. I mean, people clearly, in fact, at this point, wonderfully maintain two Psy-world identities. The one that is aggregating information for their family and their lineage, and the one no one else knows about. And there's some very different kind of play that is now starting to happen there, but in the early days of technology coming there, this was very much seen as mapping onto Korean notions about the size of your network was the size of your influence. And so everything was an opportunity to grow your network.
Mark Zuckerberg famously said that privacy was over. And I actually am curious what the two of you think about this notion. I mean, you were talking about if we could just accept that we had these multiple identities.
Yeah, I think a pseudonymous culture in which each user has a specific chosen strategy is the way to go. Each of us has to, and we need many more discussions to really sort of think about what are good strategies to use with privacy online. But the idea that you would have several pseudonyms operating at once online and a couple of real ones, a couple of your real identities too, and that you would you would be able to establish a little bit of a buffer between those identities, however thick you would want that buffer to be. I think we have to construct what those buffers are. You can decide on any given online community if you want to be friends with that person or not be friends with them. If you decide that the only people the pseudonym will connect to are people who know you face to face, then you can erect that kind of privacy. It's not full privacy, and of course there's what the company has access to also, which is the real issue that most people have with Facebook. But I think that each of us can erect privacy barriers of a sort between our pseudonyms, between our avatars, let's say.
I think maybe we'd like to be able to. The question or concern I have right now is technologically, because of advertisers, because of the push, the commercialization, the desire to get as much information about us, share it with advertisers, that actually it's getting hard to do that.
Yeah, but I'd have to say as an anthropologist two things. One, first is that privacy is hardly a stable concept. This is hardly something that if we were to poll every single person in this room and say, what does privacy mean to you, you, and you, chances are it would be three very different answers about what it was that you kept private, from whom, under what circumstances, and what you were willing to trade off, right? My sense is that there's hardly a monolithic category where we say this is privacy and everyone agrees to its definition. I mean, not only do I think it's profoundly cultural, but I think it's located in a bunch of other things. I also think historically privacy is a fairly unstable category. When we think about what privacy meant in the 1950s and the 1850s, those are two very different ideas. And there's a whole set of things in our physical built world that have changed our ideas of privacy. We have individual dwellings now in the United States that create a very different notion about a private space one can retreat to that really simply wasn't possible in most urban settings 100 years ago. So, how we think about privacy, how we police it, what the barrier is, whether it's physical, whether it's technological, whether it's social, those things have been profoundly unstable, I would argue, over 100 years. And the conversation we're having now is actually much more amplified, but it's one that we've been having repeatedly over decades about what it is that we disclose, to whom, under what circumstances, and with what consequences. I mean, that's not a new conversation. The consequences of it may be different, and the strategies we use, I think, are in fact remarkably the same. I mean, I'm fascinated by the ways people choose to lie as a strategy to protect privacy. I mean, we sometimes would call it pseudonyms, but sometimes it's just outright lies. Are you telling them my birth date? Absolutely not. And I plan to, in fact, make up a birth date. I mean, the statistics on the early days of MySpace, where 15% of MySpace users were over the age of 100, seemed wonderfully improbable. So, it was quite clear people were going, oh, what's the first date? Oh, 1904, click. And there was sort of clearly a sense that people didn't either orient to the question as being serious or feel any need to tell the correct answer. And I think, one of the things I notice as a researcher that I'm always fascinated by is what are the strategies people are using to hold back the information they think is really valuable.
Exactly. I mean, in terms of the corporate control, of course, I think that generally we should fight for our rights to be safe from a corporate central unit. But there are lots of strategies people use in their individual lives online. Just saying you were born in 1895 or something, misspelling your last name. There are a lot, having 3 digits wrong on your Social Security number. I mean, there are lots of ways you can protect your own privacy or whatever you want to, your distance from the center.
We have some questions from the audience rolling in at the moment. So I'm going to take a few here. I guess somebody is asking, how can the internet actually shape culture the way TV shows do, for example, Lost and Friends? I think it actually has a bigger effect. But I'm curious what you would say in some ways.
I want to hear your bigger effect.
Well, because
argument.
it's so interactive. It's so interactive, that the people watching or involved in some ways can actually help shape the ending. And as we're moving into video games and online video games, and that becoming a form of narrative and creation of your own narrative within video games, I think but maybe that's a misleading way of putting it. You're probably much more expert at that than I would be.
Well, I think that's a great question. I'm really going to think about that question, first of all, because of the presumption in the question that television shapes culture. I like that. I mean, I want to think about that idea a lot more. This goes back to one of your early points to me, Laura, when we were talking for your report last year, which was we used to all watch the same television shows. We used to watch the news in numbers that were 60 million strong per nightly newscast among the 3 networks. I mean, that's a lot. That means that most Americans were watching news at that time on that day, and they were just picking between the anchors. That's what those numbers mean. American Idol at its maximum gets 30 million viewers, and
right.
That's American Idol, So a mass audience today is at the most half of what it used to be, and for a very different kind of programming too. So we perhaps television used to shape culture in the sense that it used to speak to a lot of people all at the same time with the same programming. But I think since even cable and time shifting and the post-network era of television, I would say that it shapes culture a lot less, I guess, but I see Genevieve.
Well, I'm also just thinking, if you pop that question up a level, while the programming itself may not shape discourse in quite the way it once did, the physical object still does. Most homes are still physically oriented around television. There's still a notion of when the television should be on and when it shouldn't. So television shapes, I would argue it's shaped time and space irrespective of the kind of fragmentation of viewing. And in that way, internet is interesting, right? I think you can make an argument, and I'm sure many of us know this to our peril, that internet has changed our ideas about time. So how quick is quick anymore? How long is too long to wait for someone to answer your email? And I think our expectations of immediacy have shifted dramatically. And while it may not be about the content of the internet, I think the physicality of it, again, has had this really interesting impact on at least our ideas about time.
Yeah.
But has that, this is a question I did, and this is what we met sort of talking about this topic. I do really wonder, though, is that a common culture? It was, when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan many, many moons ago, the numbers of people who watched it,
it's still the highest rated, I think. Still the highest
MASH,
rated.
the last episode of MASH
Beatles,
remains still the highest rated, and it was something, probably like 40% of the country watched it, and those who didn't watch it heard about it over the water cooler. And this is one thing I wonder about as we move forward, and we have these little spaces. So how is the internet shaping culture? Aggregators
are very important this way, and having your portal sites that gather the programming for you into one place, I do think those sites become very important. If you are part of any, if you regularly visit a certain aggregator site, like I visit Gawker, but I'm into celebrities. If you visit any one site regularly and it collects videos of the day and it collects interesting things that happened in the news and interesting text, then that's what you have in common with everyone else who visits that site regularly. It is more fragmented than the 60 million who watch the nightly newscasts, but it might also speak to a more certain specific taste culture or demographic. So, but I do think those sites, I think Gawker Media, which bought out a whole bunch of blogs dealing with culture and entertainment and media, now Gawker is an influencer. And they do appear, they get mentioned in television shows too. And on CNN's, blog review of the week or whatever that show is called. Now television calls back to the aggregators.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a lot more, as I was saying, more interactivity, I think, in terms of what's going on. And maybe that's an experience we're all sharing, is some sense of this kind of, you can talk back to it. It's not just talking to you.
Oh, and clearly, various social institutions struggling with what to make sense of that. When Cameron and Clegg took over the British government, right, one of the first things they did was open up a Web 2.0 site, which was basically, tell us what we should do. We want all the bright ideas you have. And, not surprisingly, the bright ideas were things like imprison Tony Blair, do away with the NIH, send all immigrants away, burn down Buckingham Palace. And, the British government kind of had a moment of going, okay, when we asked for your opinions, we hoped you'd give us the helpful ones. And there was this kind of interesting expectation of, what does it mean to say we're going to open up a space for dialogue? Because we know that's a good thing. Engaging our citizens, good. Internet, good way to do that. With every time you do it, a whole lot of people are going to tell you a whole lot of things you really can't operationalize if you're the British government.
I think, I did a piece on how nasty people are on the internet. And it really is remarkable. People are so cruel. And what was really interesting is that after my story, we put the stories up on the website, the comments were so nasty.
I was going to say, were people nasty about that?
It really was, it was remarkable. And I think, this is something as we move forward, one of the things that news organizations are beginning to do is reconsider just opening it up. That this was an early ethos in the internet, that you wanted this very, very free-wheeling dialogue. And I think a lot of people are like, well, maybe not so free, maybe a little more curation of that. Well, somebody, leading into what you just said though, somebody asked, do you have insights into the differences between government 2.0 in Australia and 2.0 in the US?
Yes. And I'm trying to think about if I can say them and not get myself in trouble. I did have the most extraordinary moment, you will particularly like this, of being in a government office as this particular government agency who deals a lot with youth, was thinking about whether they should have a Facebook page. And the first thing the person said was, what if we don't get any friends? And it was in a sort of extraordinary moment of going, okay, that's an interesting way to think about this problem. So, I think, part of it was you had this challenge of a government wanting to open itself up to this technology, but the people who were leading the government not being intimately familiar with it. And one of the things I absolutely encountered, and I think this would be true in American government as much as Australian, was that the very civil servants, the government workers you were asking to regulate and think about these spaces, were using technology that citizens had given up years ago. Half of the South Australian government is still operating on a version of Windows that is not backwards or forwards compatible with anything. And there are people with Romeo machines, mimeograph machines, which I'm sure are not even old enough to be in this museum. And there was this really interesting sense of what does it mean to ask a government agency who isn't using the most recent technology to think about regulating the contemporary one. So there was all of those things. I think the most interesting thing, though, in the last 2 years has been that the Australian government actually commissioned a federal inquiry that was tasked to think about what government 2.0 would look like and what it meant to take on the web. And there were a series of really interesting community meetings where government actually listened and sat with citizens and asked those kind of questions. And there were some really kind of fascinating ideas about what it meant not just to have technologies that let you talk back, but what that actually meant for challenging ideas about what did civic participation mean, what was the nature of government. And then I think, the second order of questions, which I have to say I continue to be really engaged by, was what does it mean then if you plan, for all kinds of reasons, to move government services online, for reasons of efficiency, for reasons of open access. What does it mean if a third of your population isn't themselves online?
Yeah.
Or what does it mean if the ones who aren't literate in ways that let them make sense of the technology? Or what if they're on connections that are really badly configured? So most of the internet in the West is configured so that it is faster download than upload, and it's skewed anywhere between 3 to 1 to 7 to 1. So easy to consume, little difficult to participate. And if what you're doing is asking people to participate in government, it turns out even the way you configure the internet has huge consequences for that. And so my government back home is currently kind of grappling with those issues of what it means to think about the physicality of the internet and how that will impact participation. But then there are also some really lovely Australian kind of mashups. So they offered up a whole series of government data files, right? Basically put them out there and said, anything you can come up with, have at, right? And the one that won the mashup competition was something called It's Buggered, Mate, which is nowhere near as naughty as I know you immediately think, and was actually about, you could basically log onto this website and complain about things that were broken. So potholes, barbecues, public lavatories, and you could flag what the state of it was, and you could go back and visit it regularly and put photos online to demonstrate that it still hadn't been fixed. And it became this kind of wonderful way of documenting your local environment and your rising level of annoyance with government service, with the happy kind of mashup of Google Maps.
Lovely.
And, the government overlay, so.
Well, just quickly, and this is a plug, so I apologize in advance. If you'd like to take a look at Government 2.0 in this country, you can go to Opinion Space, which is a project that I was a part of developing at UC Berkeley. And Opinion Space is now the opinion gathering app for the State Department. So you can find it both at Berkeley and at the State Department, and you can register your opinions. It doesn't allow comments, which I think is interesting, so it can't get nasty. But it does show you, based on a series of questions, how close or far you are to other people all over the world, and also to landmark individuals. So it's interesting to see when it's not just an XY axis where you fall into a space of opinion. So I recommend it.
Here's a question here. Do you see any historical parallels to this stage of internet communication and the Enlightenment, printing, urbanization?
Yes, we are, there has never been, well, never, since the Gutenberg Revolution, I think that we have not, in Western culture, thought so hard about the Middle Ages as now. Now is the time for us to really remember and think about medieval culture. And then early modern culture that immediately succeeds it. I mean, the transition from manuscript to printed text is enormous. And the things, in a way, the transition from print to internet is almost a reversal back to more medieval ways of interacting with culture. Marginalia was a huge part of manuscript culture. So the idea that a text that you would receive would not just be inviolate, but that you would write all over that thing. You would make it what was called a commonplace book and sort of write little notes to yourself, write different endings of the story of Parsifal or whatever. And that, if you look at a manuscript text, there is so much of that there. And then print came along, and print was the official version. It was the official version, the single version, and you got a copy of that one version. And so people didn't stop interacting with print. I mean, there was still a lot of, marginalia, but for better or for worse, for example, any museum or archive with a great Shakespeare collection of Shakespeare folios and quartos will have perfectly clean copies. Now, what a shame for us that we didn't save the ones that people wrote all over. We only saved the clean copies. But the manuscript text, we have all of that interactivity and all of that copying too. Copyright holders really hate the fact that the internet permits a huge remix culture, a huge mashup culture, a huge copy and paste culture. Well, when it was all handwritten, the whole culture was that if you wanted that text, you would copy it. I mean, you would find somebody that could hand write that thing out, and you would get a copy. And so I think that we're going back to a more medieval mentality of how to spread culture and how to use culture. And I find that really fascinating.
That is. I hadn't even thought of that at all. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that, and I didn't realize that scholars were actually thinking about that. Any thoughts about
just the one perfect counter example. In Geneva, in Switzerland, in the period when the Gutenberg press hits Geneva, there's a man who owns it. He's very interested in opening it up to everyone. And for a 3-year period, right after this press literally lands in his house, he prints pamphlets all day, 24 hours a day, for 3 years, and everyone in Geneva who had an opinion came to him with their opinion in a pamphlet, and he would publish it.
Oh, nice.
And this period in Geneva, literally, when the Post arrived, it was 37 different versions of people's opinions about what was happening in Geneva. And there's an entire collection of these held in one of the museums there, and it's like looking at blogging.
Wonderful.
I mean, it is this kind of moment where it's like anyone who could write, who had an opinion, got to publish it.
Yeah.
And so for 3 years, everyone in Geneva read everything, and then afterwards, everyone went, okay, that was a bit exhausting. Let's find a few people whose opinions are actually thought out and well-reasoned. And it kind of diminished down from this extraordinary explosion of content down to this kind of, I mean, in some ways stabilizing around the good storytellers and the provocative opinions. And you go from this extraordinary sort of technology enabling everyone to have a voice to people kind of going, yeah, okay, that was a bit noisy. Can we go down to just a few? That'd be good. And could someone else edit them for us?
Well, one of the hypotheses about history that we're testing right now is Habermas's hypothesis about the French Revolution, which is that the explosion of print in the 100 years prior to the French Revolution, which caused all the noise, and anyone that had an opinion would publish in the broadsheet of that week, and that was so different that the cafe culture plus the print, the sort of explosion of print and the publishing of broadsheets led over the course of a century to a complete overhaul of government in the nation. And that he called the public sphere, that the public sphere was born, that it wasn't just the court that determined what was going to happen, that all of a sudden there was this thing called the public, and the public started to say what it wanted to happen. Now, I think we are really going to test this hypothesis that Habermas proposed, which has many doubters, by the way, of whether the explosion of communication and diversity of this period of the internet will lead in 100 years or less, who knows, to a revolution of some kind. And what would that revolution be? What, could people in 1700 have foreseen the death of the king? What can we foresee now in the next few centuries that would somehow arise from this explosion of opinion?
I think it's hard to know, and I think it has created, I mean, just looking at it politically, of course, and looking at what goes on news sites, it has created an extraordinary explosion. And as I sort of said early on, of a lot of information and a lot of it inaccurate, and a lot of debate. And so I think that's sort of a really open-ended question. This question I'm kind of laughing at.
In a kind way.
In a kind way, because it's actually a very good question, and I'm not sure that any of us will entirely be able to answer it, which is, what do you think of mobile internet usage in the car while moving by the driver? Will it evolve? Next year's driver is this year's school student. I think about this and I think, oh boy, this is such a, I go to CES usually every year where they have the new car technology, and they're always showing me they've got more things you can do in the car, and I keep thinking, how about drive? But I don't know, do either of you have any thoughts on this one? I'm not sure.
When it's flying cars, it's going to be nuts up there. When there's a z-axis for the motion, it's going to be crazy.
I mean, there is more and more. I have to say, I do see this pretty much every year I go. There is more and more stuff that you are doing in your car. Fortunately, voice recognition software is getting better, so that you can, in fact, rather than having to read something, you can speak. And you can say, give me directions to such and such a place. But even I find, right now, the Android phone has the ability to ask directions and it will talk to you. But even the idea, though, of holding the phone at all while you're driving is sort of worrisome to me, so.
Well, there's another thing that kind of runs through that question too, right, which is also a sense of the overloading of spaces with technology. And one of the other things we've heard in a lot of work we've done recently is what it means to start thinking about spaces that won't have technology. And what might it mean to carve out places that are technology free or that are only certain kinds of technology? And I've seen it both mandated. So Korea, again, when I was there, used to have this amazing network of cell site dampeners inside churches, so your phone didn't work, with a note in the lobby that said, it would be a blessing if you turn off your phone, and turn off your phone and listen for the call of God, and then we have a cell site dampener, so nothing's going to happen anyway. And it was charming, right? But there was this really interesting notion there of what did it mean to start carving out spaces where technology wasn't socially appropriate. I mean, British railway cars have had a quiet car for years now. I think, and there's this sense about what does it mean to imagine there will be spaces where technology may or may not be appropriate, both in a kind of safety sense, but also in kind of notions about socially appropriate. And I think, you were talking much earlier, right, about the fact that we haven't stabilized the etiquette yet.
Yes.
And I think there's this really interesting thing that's going on here where we forget how new some of these technologies are. And I grew up in Australia, and television came a little bit later to us, but all the way through my childhood and my adolescence, there were still conversations going on in Australia in the public sphere about when did television get turned on? Did you turn it on? Did you turn it off when guests came over? Was it okay to turn it on if you didn't have a program in mind that you were going to watch? If you were eating food in front of it, was that a good thing or a bad thing? How far away should you be from it? And we were trying to work out what was our relationship going to be to that, and that took 20 or 30 years to stabilize.
Yeah, exactly. I think this etiquette takes a long time. This awareness, this consciousness takes a while to build up. And what this question is really about is attention. Yeah. And attention is a serious issue today that we need to give some attention to. Not just in driving, but I think it's hazardous to walk without looking to see where you are going. I mean, I see a lot of people immersed in the sort of, 6-inch bubble formed around them by their small device. And when those people walk the streets, it's hazardous. Yep. They bump into you all the time. So I think that there do need to be a lot more conversations, even just among oneself, of let me try to remember that if I have my mobile device in my hand, to look up approximately every 30 seconds, or however, whatever is the appropriate amount of time. I don't think these are questions that can't be answered, and I actually don't think they can, of course they can be regulated by the law that you can't be holding your phone to your ear while driving, but I do think that there is a kind of discussion we each have to have with ourselves and with our families and with people we encounter about what is appropriate right now. Is it appropriate for somebody to answer a text or a call they get when they're dining out with you casually? I mean, when you're at a dinner with friends, should somebody have the phone out of their pocket, or should they not answer it, or should they have turned it off in the first place? Or should they say, oh, excuse me, I'm very sorry? What is that? The role of that technology in that society.
And we know that is always a combination of legislation, social regulation, and the development of a kind of, what become the kind of codes of behavior. And those take ages to emerge.
Another question here specifically for you, and this has to do with split identities. When one or more of these split identities is criminal or scary, safety-wise, I guess we assume people are innocent until proven guilty. I guess I'm not exactly, I should say I'm not entirely clear, other than I guess there is some concern about being able to keep an eye on somebody who is criminal.
I think what we have come to, we've been talking about custom and culture and codes of behavior. I think one thing we can say we have arrived at is a phase of sophistication with what can we expect online. We can expect a lot of porn. There's a lot of porn online. We can expect people trying to take advantage of you and sending you emails that claim you just won £1 million or something. You can expect that people will be nasty in political conversations or religious conversations or conversations about current events or something like that. We didn't actually used to expect this. I mean, in 1997 or 98, the flame wars would just go on because people really felt like, I am right about this, and you are wrong, and I'm going to argue this point to the end. And there were also lots of cases of people believing the £1 million that they won. And there were also a lot of people who got emails from people asking them for their social security number, claiming they were a representative of their bank, and people emailing them their social security number. I think that we now have a little bit more of a thicker skin about people trying to take advantage of us or be aggressive with us online, and we are a little more sophisticated as a people. Like, I've seen a few posts recently sort of mocking celebrities who left Twitter because people were mean to them, and the posts were sort of like, where have these people been online? No one's ever been mean to you online. I mean, get over it, you know? And so I think just as we have the get over it rule with the nasty people, we also have the don't ever answer that email rule with the predators. Don't open that email, it's junk mail. I don't recognize that email address, and that's certainly not my bank, you know?
Yeah.
And I think there's a little bit more sophistication that helps protect us from the kind of attacks that might come at us. But of course, crime online has been with us from the start.
Yeah, it has been with us from the start, and it's a complicated question as to how much you should allow the government to reach in, and I think we're still grappling with that. Where companies like Google have fought subpoenas from the government to get information, and these companies have an enormous amount of information about us. Somebody here cited, and this was on Terry Gross today, actually. He said on NPR today, so we'll give NPR a plug. There was a discussion of the recent Wall Street Journal technology report, and if anybody saw these were actually incredibly well done articles about the number of cookies and flash cookies and beacons placed on people's computers every time they visit a website. So you visit a website, and this is something that as the internet has gotten commercialized, and I do think back to those young students on campuses who were loving the internet and saying, don't commercialize it. And that is where we are, though, today. These cookies often shape content that we see next. In fact, I remember hearing, somebody put a pair of shoes in their cart briefly, took them out, too expensive, and the shoes kept following her around. So every time she went to another website, there would be an advertisement for the same pair of shoes. So to what extent, I guess, is this, this driving what the internet has become, this, deep sense of commercialization, of knowing more and more about you, knowing where you go, then, having some sense of this is what you're going to see.
And Laura, I just want to warn you, we have like a minute.
Oh, okay.
I'm so the wrong person to answer that question then.
I like AI. I like the internet getting to know me if it is going to be commercialized. And I think that a discussion I've been having with people more recently is how much time does it take you to train that AI? How much information do you have to give Amazon before what it recommends to you is a book you would read, as opposed to something you would never read in a million years? And you have to do a lot of education, it seems, right now to train the internet to know you. But I think I would rather have it try to sell me a pair of shoes I actually wanted than show me a lot of banner ads for really random things.
That's definitely the upside of it. Well, I guess we could get to the dark place in it. And actually, I was talking to Connie Willis, who's a science fiction author today, about the way science fiction often sees inventions and sees into the future, and how that's often an inspiration for what people invent. And I said, but science fiction is so dark. And she said, well, science fiction, really, these are just tools to explore what Faulkner did as well, which is the human heart, which doesn't change. So I think, as we move forward, these technologies continue to be, I think, in one way or another, a reflection of the human heart and who we are. And that doesn't change. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that, Laura and Genevieve and Gail. It's just been a terrific evening. One of the challenges and opportunities of being a contemporary history museum is that we try whenever possible to take the lessons of the past and connect them to the possibilities of the future. And I think this is one of those nights when that really came together. And so please join me in saying thank you once more to our panelists, and have a great night.